A stone giant stands silent against a stormy sky. We see its imposing walls, but we have lost the true story of its creation. Forget the simple myths from films and fairy tales. The real secrets of medieval castle construction are far more ingenious and far more bizarre than anything you have seen on screen. Today, you will learn the hidden engineering marvels that modern experts are still struggling to comprehend. How did walls secretly listen for enemies? Why were toilets considered a form of disinfectant? By the end, you will see these ancient fortresses not as crude piles of rock, but as the pinnacle of technological and psychological design. What does a castle's greatest strength reveal about the minds that built it? These silent stone giants were not born from a community effort, but from the mind of a single, shadowy genius. We know the names of kings and nobles, but the master mason, the true architect of these marvels, has almost always vanished from the record. This unknown engineer was a figure of immense and almost mystical knowledge, blending practical geometry, the raw physics of weight and force, and what many at the time would have called alchemy. He did not learn from books, but through a secretive system of guilds and a long, arduous apprenticeship. His most critical plans were rarely committed to parchment. They were guarded secrets, passed verbally from master to apprentice, locked away in a memory trained for immense complexity. The survival of a castle, its ability to withstand sieges and centuries of decay, stands as the only real testament to his skill. He was the unsung hero of the medieval world, a phantom whose brilliance is etched into the very stones we walk past today. How did such a man, working without modern tools or mathematics, calculate the perfect angle for a defensive wall or the precise arch to support a towering gatehouse? The answer lies in a forgotten language of ropes, rods, and geometric secrets. That phantom architect's first secret was not hidden in a vault, but in the very shape of the walls themselves. Look closely at any great medieval fortress, and you will notice something strange. The massive stone walls do not rise straight up. They lean inwards ever so slightly. This is called a batter, and for centuries, we were told it was only for stability, to help the wall resist siege engines and its own immense weight. But that is only half the story. This subtle inward curve was a stroke of acoustic genius. The master mason calculated the precise angles so that any sound originating at the base of the wall, the scuff of a boot, the clink of armor, the whispered command from an attacker below, would be captured and funneled upwards. The entire facade acted as a colossal sound mirror, amplifying faint noises and carrying them directly to the defenders stationed on the battlements high above. In the dead of night, when visibility was zero, the castle itself became a giant stone ear. A guard could press his own ear against the cold stone and listen to the wall itself, hearing the movements of a besieging force with startling clarity. This was a form of primitive sonar and auditory early warning system built directly into the architecture. The wall was not a passive barrier. It was a listening device, a sentient structure that whispered the enemy's secrets to those who knew how to listen. Can you conceive of the meticulous planning required to achieve this? The mason had to balance the structural need for a stable slope with the acoustic need for a specific angle of reflection. He did this not with digital sound modeling, but with ropes, plumb lines, and an intuitive grasp of geometry passed down through generations. The silence of the castle was an illusion. Its walls were always speaking, and if the walls could listen, what other secrets were hidden in the very ground upon which they stood? Yet the most deceptive part of the castle was not its listening walls, but its main entrance. What appeared to be the weakest point was, in fact, the deadliest. The gatehouse was a masterclass in psychological and physical warfare, a series of intricate death traps disguised as a simple doorway. Imagine approaching those massive wooden gates, only to find yourself forced into a sharp, immediate turn. This was the chicane, a zigzag passage built just inside the entrance. It was a simple yet devastating innovation. A battering ram, swung by a dozen men, became completely useless without a straight run to build momentum. A charging knight on horseback was forced to a clumsy, vulnerable halt. You were not marching into a fortress. You were being funneled, disoriented and slowed, into a carefully designed kill zone. Above you, the ceiling was pocked with murder holes. From these openings, defenders would rain down not just arrows, but quicklime to blind you, boiling water, and heavy stones. Just as you recovered from that horror, a second threat would slam down from the darkness. The portcullis was a colossal iron or timber grate, its bottom edge studded with spikes. It would drop in an instant, crashing down behind the first wave of attackers, cutting them off from their own army and trapping them inside the stone tunnel. Now you were caught between two iron gates, with death pouring from the ceiling, in a space too tight to even raise your shield effectively. The gatehouse was never a door. It was a throat, and the castle was waiting to swallow you whole. How could any army hope to breach such a brilliantly malicious design? The answer lies not in stronger siege engines, but in a far more subtle art of attack, one that targeted the castle's hidden, beating heart. But even the most lethal gatehouse had to provide for the most basic human needs. And here, the castle's architects revealed another layer of their genius. High up in the stone walls, often tucked away in a quiet corner of the great hall or a private chamber, you would find the garderobe. At first glance, it seems like just a primitive medieval toilet, a simple stone seat over a dark hole. But this humble room was an engineering marvel of hygiene and practicality. These latrines were almost always designed as small chambers projecting outward from the main castle wall. A long vertical chute, sometimes lined with smooth stone, would plunge straight down from the seat, often emptying directly into the moat below or a deep, purpose-built cesspit. This was not just about waste disposal. It was a deliberate and effective sanitation system. By placing the outlet in the flowing water of a moat, the castle effectively had a self-cleaning function, using the natural current to carry waste away from the living quarters. But the true secret of the garderobe was in the air itself. The constant downward draft of the chute created a natural ventilation system, pulling fresh air in from the chamber and sending odors down and out. And within that stone shaft, a chemical reaction was taking place. The accumulating urine would slowly break down, releasing ammonia gas. In an age before modern disinfectants, this ammonia-rich environment acted as a powerful natural cleanser. It killed bacteria and pests, preventing the spread of disease in a way that was utterly mysterious to the people of the time. This same property led to the room's unique dual purpose. The nobles who used these rooms would often hang their valuable robes and garments in the garderobe. The pungent ammonia fumes, a byproduct of the waste, would kill moths and other fabric-eating insects, preserving the fine wool and cloth. This is where the name itself comes from the French words garter, meaning to keep, and robe, meaning clothing. So this was not merely a toilet. It was a walk-in disinfectant chamber and a primitive dry cleaner, all built into the castle's defensive shell. The same ingenuity that devised death traps for invaders also created a sophisticated, multi-purpose system for health and household management. If the castle could cleanse itself and protect its inhabitants from disease, what other hidden systems were in place to sustain life during a long and brutal siege? The castle's ability to cleanse itself was remarkable, but its true test of endurance came from a far more fundamental need. A fortress could have impenetrable walls and lethal gatehouses, yet it would all be for nothing without one single, non-negotiable resource: water. The hidden well was the castle's silent, beating heart, and its existence was a secret guarded as fiercely as any treasure vault. This was not a simple hole in the ground. Constructing it was a monumental feat of medieval engineering, often requiring laborers to dig straight down through solid bedrock for the equivalent of a 10-story building. They did this with little more than picks, hammers, and sheer human determination, hauling countless baskets of rubble back to the surface by hand. The location of this well was a decision of life and death. It was almost always placed deep within the castle's inner bailey, or even more securely, inside the base of the great keep itself. This ensured it was the last point an invading army could ever reach, protected by every layer of defense the castle possessed. But the master masons went even further in their cunning. To safeguard this precious lifeline from being poisoned by a stealthy enemy or blocked during a siege, they designed elaborate deceptions. The well shaft itself was often capped with a heavy, locked stone lid. More astonishingly, many castles featured secret, twisting tunnels that allowed trusted servants to access the wellhead from a concealed chamber, drawing water without ever revealing its true location in the central courtyard. An enemy scout peering over the walls might never even know the well was there. The entire survival of the garrison, sometimes hundreds of people, depended on this single hidden source. It was a secret more valuable than gold, a triumph of perseverance and clandestine design. With their water secure, how did these stone giants manage to feed an entire community while completely cut off from the outside world? Beyond the moat and murder holes, the castle's true power was written in stone, a language of symbolism understood by every soul in the medieval world. Its layout was far more than a military blueprint. It was a deliberate, three-dimensional diagram of the entire feudal universe, designed to project the Lord's authority as an unshakable, God-given truth. At the center of it all stood the keep, the massive stone tower. This was not just the final stronghold. It was the head of the entire body, the seat of the Lord's will and intellect. From its highest windows, he could survey his entire domain, a constant visual reminder of his power and his all-seeing presence. Spreading out from the keep were the inner and outer bailies, the courtyards and living spaces. These areas represented the body of the castle, bustling with the lifeblood of its community. The inner bailey, closer to the keep, housed the noble family, the chapel, and the great hall. The outer bailey was for workshops, stables, and the homes of common soldiers and servants. This physical separation was a perfect mirror of the rigid social hierarchy. Your place in society dictated how close you could get to the symbolic head. Encasing this entire body were the mighty curtain walls, the limbs, and the skin of the castle. They reached out to define the territory, to embrace and to protect, but also to separate and to exclude. Every person who entered, from the lowest peasant to the highest visiting knight, was forced to move through this symbolic body, passing from the outer limbs, through the working body, and finally, if granted permission, approaching the head itself. This architectural journey was a constant, silent lesson in the feudal order, reinforcing who commanded and who obeyed. But the symbolism went even deeper, into the very geometry of the stones. Master masons frequently employed sacred geometry, using ratios and proportions believed to be divinely inspired. They would align chapels so that on the patron saint's day, the rising sun would illuminate the altar in a blaze of heavenly light. Great halls were sometimes designed with specific dimensions that echoed biblical descriptions of temples, subtly suggesting that the Lord's rule was sanctioned by heaven itself. By harnessing the perceived power of celestial events and holy mathematics, the castle became more than a fortress. It became a microcosm of a universe where the Lord's power was as natural and as ordained as the sun rising in the east. If the stones themselves proclaimed the ruler's divine right, what other invisible forces did the builders harness to make these structures feel so permanently, overwhelmingly powerful? While the stones themselves proclaimed divine order, they were raised to the sky by a forgotten army of laborers who left no names behind. This was not an army of men, but of animals, a secret, massive workforce essential to every stage of construction. We all know about the oxen, those patient, powerful beasts that dragged the heaviest stones on wooden sledges. But the true specialists were the castle horses. These were not the slender war horses of the knights. They were a specially bred class of animal, colossal draft horses known as great horses, standing as tall as a man at the shoulder and bred for a single purpose, raw hauling power. A team of these giants, hitched to a massive wooden capstan, could walk in a continuous circle to wind a rope onto a drum. This simple machine, powered by their endless plodding, could lift multi-ton blocks of quarried stone high into the air, placing them with a precision that human hands alone could never achieve. They were the living cranes of the medieval world, their steady, clopping pace the rhythm to which the castle walls ascended. Alongside them, teams of large dogs patrolled the sprawling construction sites day and night. They were not pets. They were a vital security force, guarding the priceless stacks of timber, the iron tools, and the stockpiles of food from thieves and scavengers, both human and animal. The scale of this animal labor was a logistical miracle, a constant symphony of braying, whinnying, and barking that has been completely silenced by time. But the most shocking use of animals was reserved for the final, brutal test of a castle's strength. Before a siege, attackers would sometimes use captured bears or other large, powerful beasts. They would be driven towards vulnerable points in the defenses, their frantic clawing and pounding at the base of a wooden gate or a newly built section of wall acting as a grim, living test of its structural integrity. If the wood splintered or the mortar shook loose, the commanders would know exactly where to focus their assault. This entire hidden ecosystem of animal power, from the patient horses to the ferocious testers, reveals that a castle was not just a product of human genius. It was the pinnacle of a forgotten partnership between species, a collaboration of muscle and instinct that made the impossible stone giant possible. With such immense resources devoted to building these fortresses, what happened when the money ran out, forcing builders to resort to deception on a grand scale? Fire was the invisible enemy that every castle architect feared more than any army. A single stray spark in a hall filled with tapestries and timber could reduce a mighty fortress to a smoldering shell in hours. But the master mason had a secret weapon hidden underfoot, a layered defense built directly into the floor. This was not a single slab of stone, which could crack and shatter under intense heat. It was a composite material, a medieval fireproofing system of astonishing sophistication. The first layer, the foundation, was a thick bed of clay packed tightly with rubble and broken stone. This dense base acted as a heat sink, absorbing and dispersing thermal energy before it could reach the vulnerable wooden support beams below. On top of this, the masons applied a middle layer that was the true key to its resilience. They mixed lime plaster with a surprising ingredient, animal hair, often from horses or cattle. This was not a random addition. The thousands of tiny fibers created a reinforced matrix within the plaster, giving the entire layer a flexible strength that could expand and contract with temperature changes without cracking. It was like weaving a microscopic net of resilience right into the floor. Finally, the top surface was finished with either tightly fitted clay tiles or a specially hardened, polished plaster. This final layer was the first line of defense, designed to be non-flammable and to prevent embers from taking hold. When a fire broke out in the Great Hall, this triple-layered floor would resist the inferno's fury. The top layer blocked the flames, the flexible middle layer absorbed the stress of the heat, and the thick clay base below prevented the thermal transfer that could ignite the entire structure from underneath. This was passive safety engineering at its finest, a technology born from necessity and a deep, practical understanding of materials. In a world lit by open flame, the floor you stood on was not just a surface. It was a shield, a carefully engineered barrier between a thriving community and total annihilation. With such clever defenses against the elements and enemies, one has to wonder what final, ingenious secret allowed these stone giants to withstand the relentless assault of time itself. Hidden in plain sight, on the weathered face of 1,000 stones, lies a secret language. These are the mason's marks, strange little symbols chiseled into the rock, a fleeting signature from a man whose name is otherwise lost to history. For a long time, we believed these were simple ownership marks, a way for the master mason to count how many stones a worker had cut and thus determine his pay. But that explanation is far too simple. These cryptic carvings were, in fact, a highly sophisticated three-dimensional barcode, a complex code that managed the entire chaotic process of construction. Each symbol held multiple layers of information. First, it identified the individual mason or the team of quarriers responsible for that specific block. This was about more than payment. It was about accountability. If a stone cracked under pressure, the master mason could trace it back to its creator. Second, and more ingeniously, the mark often indicated the stone's precise final position within the sprawling puzzle of the wall. A simple arrow or a unique set of lines could tell the builders exactly how to orient the block, which face should be outward, and even which course or layer it belonged to. This was the key to assembling a structure of such perfect balance with a largely illiterate workforce. They were not reading plans, they were reading the stones themselves. And sometimes, a third piece of data was encoded, a subtle quality grade. A particular dash or notch might signal that this was a premium block, fit for a critical load-bearing arch, while another mark might relegate a slightly flawed stone to a less important section of the inner wall. To decipher these marks today is to crack the castle's genetic code. By mapping their locations, archaeologists can literally trace the workflow across the site, seeing how different teams of masons worked in tandem, their individual progress marked in stone. You can see where one highly skilled group handled the complex corners of the keep while another, perhaps a less experienced crew, built a simpler stretch of curtain wall. These silent symbols are the closest we can come to hearing the voices of the builders themselves, a permanent record of their pride, their skill, and their shared effort. They transformed the castle from a monolithic, anonymous structure into a collective human achievement, with every chisel stroke telling a story. If these tiny marks reveal the individual, What other hidden messages were left behind for us to find? That secret language of the Masons was carved for the eyes of a select few, but the castle's most powerful message was broadcast to everyone. It was written in the terrifying language of height. The sheer, dizzying scale of the walls and the keep was not merely a byproduct of defense. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. Imagine yourself as a peasant farmer or a low-ranking soldier in an approaching army. Your entire world was built on a human scale, your home perhaps only 1 or 2 stories high. Then you see it, a stone mountain carved by man, its battlements scratching the sky. Your neck would crane backward just to see the top. Your own body, in its shadow, felt suddenly fragile and small. This was not an accident. It was a calculated design to induce awe and submission before a single arrow was ever fired. The castle was an overwhelming physical manifestation of the Lord's power, a constant, unspoken reminder that his authority was as immense and unassailable as the stone cliff he had built. This architectural intimidation was as crucial to the castle's defense as any moat or murder hole. A force that feels insignificant is a force already halfway to defeat. Why waste precious resources in a protracted battle when the very sight of your home could sap an enemy's will to fight? The master mason was not just an engineer of stone, but an engineer of the human spirit, manipulating perception to achieve his ultimate goal, absolute security. If the fortress could dominate the landscape and the mind so completely, what final, hidden vulnerability did its creators fear most? The silent intimidation of those towering walls depended on a secret calendar, a rhythm of construction that turned the changing seasons into a powerful tool. We often picture castle building as a continuous, year-round frenzy of labor, but the truth is far more strategic. The master mason orchestrated his work in harmony with the earth itself, dividing the monumental task into 3 distinct seasonal campaigns. Winter, with its bitter cold and frozen ground, was not a time of idleness. It was the season of the quarry. Men would travel to the bedrock faces, where the stone was most solid and easier to split in the frost. The freezing temperatures actually made the work safer, firming up the soil and reducing the risk of landslides as they pried massive blocks from the earth. Each stone was rough cut on site, its weight and shape determined by the master mason's mental blueprint, waiting for the thaw. Then, as the ice melted and the days grew longer, the second phase began. Spring was the season of motion. The same rains that turned roads into impassable quagmires swelled the rivers and streams, creating natural watery highways. This was the only time of year when moving multi-ton blocks of stone was remotely feasible. The quarried stones were loaded onto barges, their immense weight buoyed by the high water, and floated as close to the construction site as possible. This logistical miracle, harnessing the power of the spring floods, saved thousands of man-hours and the backs of countless oxen. Finally, summer arrived, bringing dry, warm weather. This was the window for the actual raising of the castle. The stone was on site, and now the critical work of laying it began. The mortar, a mix of limes, sand, and water, required consistent warmth to cure properly. If it froze before setting, it would become brittle and weak, compromising the entire wall's integrity. The hot, dry days of summer allowed the mortar to harden slowly and deeply, creating a bond that could last for centuries. Each season had its purpose, a deliberate step in a grand, slow dance with nature. The castle did not fight the elements, it used them. This hidden calendar reveals a profound understanding of the natural world, turning the challenges of weather into a disciplined, unstoppable assembly line. With such a meticulous plan governing every stone, what happened when the ultimate deadline arrived? and the castle had to prove its strength against a real enemy. That seasonal rhythm of construction reached its peak in the summer, not just for the weather, but for a single, critical chemical event. The mortar between the stones had to set, and the medieval recipe for this binding agent was a lost form of alchemy. Modern cement is hard and rigid, but the mortar used in the greatest castles was something else entirely. A living, breathing material with a secret ability to heal itself. The base was a simple trio of slaked lime, sand, and water, but the master masons often added a fourth, mysterious ingredient, a catalyst that transformed the mix from a simple glue into a timeless seal. They would pour in buckets of animal blood, or mix in hundreds of egg whites, or even blend in crumbled cheese. This sounds like a bizarre kitchen experiment, but it was grounded in profound chemical wisdom. The proteins in these organic additives, casein from the cheese and albumin from the eggs and blood, acted as powerful binding agents. As the mortar cured, these proteins would undergo a slow, complex reaction with the lime, creating a crystalline structure that was far more flexible and durable than a simple lime and sand paste. This is the secret to why so many ancient walls still stand tall. When a tiny crack forms from settling ground or seasonal shifts, moisture seeps inside. That moisture reacts with the unused lime and the trapped proteins still present in the centuries-old mortar, forming new crystals that slowly fill the crack from the inside out. The wall literally heals its own wounds. This self-sealing property meant that a medieval wall could adapt and endure stresses that would shatter a rigid, brittle modern concrete wall. The master mason was not just building for his own time. He was mixing a recipe for the ages, creating a stone skeleton bound together by a material that possessed a ghost of life, a slow, patient power of regeneration that we are only now beginning to fully understand. If the very glue holding the castle together was a form of organic technology, what other living materials were woven into the fabric of these stone giants? That self-healing mortar bound the stones into a single, resilient skin, but the castle's final secret was a grand deception played upon the eyes. From a distance, a great fortress appears as a perfect, symmetrical silhouette, a vision of divine order carved in stone. Yet if you were to walk its ramparts with a measuring tape, you would discover a shocking truth. This perfect balance is an elaborate lie. The master mason was also a master of illusion, employing forced perspective and deliberate asymmetries to create a mirage of flawless harmony. A tower might be subtly tapered, its sides angled so that it appears to rise straighter and taller from the vantage point of an approaching road. The windows on one side of the great hall could be spaced a hand's width farther apart than those on the other, a trick that corrected for the warping effect of distance and made the entire facade look perfectly uniform. Even the crenellations atop the walls were often carved at slightly different heights, their profiles adjusted so that from the ground below, they created a razor-straight line against the sky. This was not a sign of poor workmanship. It was a calculated psychological maneuver. A castle that appeared perfectly symmetrical, divinely ordered, and without a single flaw was far more intimidating than one that showed its human imperfections. It projected an aura of unshakable, preordained power, as if it had been grown from the earth rather than built by mortal hands. This visual trickery made the fortress seem less like a man-made structure and more like a permanent feature of the natural world, a mountain that could not be conquered. The mason manipulated stone and shadow to command not just the landscape, but the very perception of anyone who looked upon his work. He built an idea of invincibility directly into your line of sight. If even your own eyes could not be trusted to report the truth of the castle's form, what other deceptions lay in wait to confound an attacking army? While the castle projected an illusion of perfect order to the outside world, its interior was a labyrinth of whispered secrets and silent watchers. Beyond the grand halls and echoing chapels, a hidden web of observation was woven directly into the stone. Scattered throughout the fortress were dozens of tiny, almost invisible openings, no larger than a coin. These were the castle's spy holes, a sophisticated internal surveillance network designed to see everything while remaining utterly unseen. A guard stationed in a cramped, dark passage within the thickness of a wall could press his eye to one of these openings and have a perfect, uninterrupted view of the great hall below. He could watch the nobles at their feast, listen for muttered conspiracies, and monitor the mood of the household troops, all without casting a single shadow or making a sound. Other spy holes were drilled at sharp angles into the main stairwells, allowing a single sentry to track anyone ascending towards the Lord's private chambers. Guest quarters, where visiting dignitaries or potentially treacherous allies would sleep, were almost always under this silent scrutiny. The very architecture fostered a constant, low-grade paranoia, a chilling awareness that even within the safety of the walls, you might never truly be alone. This was not just about catching a spy. It was about preventing betrayal and mutiny before they could even be whispered. The castle was not just a shield against external enemies. It was a cage designed to control the people within it. How could anyone plot against the Lord when the walls themselves had eyes? This internal surveillance system turned the fortress into a panopticon, a machine for governing behavior through the mere possibility of being watched at any moment. If the stones could watch and listen, what other invisible forces did the Lord command to maintain his absolute control? Those silent watchers in the walls needed to communicate, and the castle's final architectural secret made that possible. The shift from square towers to round ones was a military revolution hidden in plain sight. For centuries, the sharp corner of a square tower was its greatest weakness. A battering ram could shatter the vulnerable angle, and catapult stones would strike a flat wall with devastating direct force. The round tower presented no such target. Its curved surface deflected projectiles, sending them glancing harmlessly off the stone. But this defensive advantage was only the beginning of the story. The true genius of the round tower was acoustic. Within that perfect circle, sound behaved in a magical way. A guard standing watch on one side of the tower could press his lips close to the cold, curved stone and whisper a message. His voice would not fade into the open air. Instead, the sound waves would travel, clinging to the curve, wrapping themselves around the entire circumference of the tower. Another guard stationed on the far side, with his own ear pressed to the wall, would hear that whisper as clearly as if the speaker were standing right beside him. This was not a design flaw or a happy accident. It was a deliberate, hidden communication network built directly into the castle's defenses. Imagine a night siege with visibility reduced to nothing and the air filled with the chaos of battle. Archers on the wall could not see an assault gathering on the opposite side of the fortress, but with their ears to the stone, a whispered warning from a distant guard, enemy at the postern gate, would travel the entire perimeter in seconds, passed like a secret from one sentry to the next through the very stones they guarded. The entire castle became a whispering gallery, a live information system that allowed defenders to coordinate their response with an efficiency their attackers could never comprehend. The round tower was more than a shield. It was a stone telephone, an ancient marvel of sonic engineering that turned the castle's walls into its most trusted messenger. That whispering stone circle depended on a constant supply of material, a logistical nightmare solved by one of the castle's greatest deceptions. The most secure quarry was not miles away, but directly under the builder's feet. To avoid long, vulnerable supply lines that could be severed by an enemy or bad weather, the master mason would seek out a building site with its own hidden bedrock. Many of the greatest fortresses were constructed literally on top of their personal stone mines. As the walls rose from the ground, laborers were simultaneously digging down, extracting the very rock that would become the next layer of defense. This created a perfect closed-loop system. There was no need for perilous journeys with heavily laden carts that could be ambushed. The stone was simply heaved from the pit and hoisted straight onto the growing wall. The stone's journey from earth to edifice was a matter of a few hundred feet, but this created a final, brilliant problem. Once the castle was complete, that gaping quarry pit, right on its doorstep, was a glaring vulnerability. It could provide cover for besiegers, or worse, be used as a starting point for tunneling under the foundations. So the master mason executed one last act of architectural sleight of hand. The quarry was systematically erased. In some cases, it was deliberately flooded, becoming a secondary, hidden moat that an attacker would unexpectedly stumble into. In others, it was carefully landscaped, filled with rubble and soil until it blended seamlessly into the surrounding terrain. Some were even transformed into secluded gardens for the nobility, their violent origin as a giant wound in the earth completely concealed by peaceful greenery. Today, finding a castle's original quarry is a major archaeological triumph. It requires peeling back centuries of overgrowth and deciphering the land itself, searching for the telltale tool marks on a buried rock face or the subtle depression in the ground that betrays the enormous volume of stone that was taken. This hidden quarry was the castle's silent, secret womb, the source of its strength and the first secret it ever kept. If the very ground the fortress stood on was part of its cunning design, what other elemental secrets were buried in the earth around it? That secret quarry was the ultimate hidden workshop, but the castle's most shocking innovation was its ability to appear almost overnight. Modern archaeology has uncovered a truth that rewrites our entire understanding of medieval military logistics. Some of the most strategically vital castles were not built stone by painstaking stone. They were assembled from a prefabricated kit, a collection of deadly components manufactured in secret and shipped to the site for lightning-fast construction. Imagine the scene from a distance. A barren hilltop, empty one week, then swarming with activity the next. Instead of the slow, chaotic cacophony of a quarry, the air would be filled with the sounds of precise assembly, the rhythmic hammering of wooden pegs into pre-drilled holes. The evidence for this lies in the wood. Master carpenters, working in secure workshops far from the frontier, would pre-cut the complex roof trusses, the massive door frames, and even entire sections of the wooden wall walks, the elevated pathways atop the ramparts. Each piece was meticulously numbered or marked with matching carpenter's symbols, a three-dimensional instruction manual carved into the timber itself. This was not a collection of raw materials. It was a flat-pack fortress designed for rapid deployment in a military emergency. When an army needed to secure a conquered territory with breathtaking speed, they did not have the luxury of a multi-year building schedule. They unloaded these pre-made components from wagons or barges and slotted them together like a colossal, life-sized puzzle. The stone core of the walls might be rough and ready, but the critical defensive elements, the parts that allowed men to stand guard and fight back, were operational in a matter of days, not months. This system of prefabrication reveals a level of centralized planning and logistical foresight we rarely attribute to the medieval world. It meant that a king could project his power across vast distances with a standardized, repeatable design, planting identical strongholds in hostile lands to choke off rebellion. The next time you look at the ruins of a castle that seems to have sprung from nowhere, consider the hidden army of carpenters who built it twice, first in the peace of their workshop, and then again on a windswept hill far from home. If a castle could be packed into a wagon, what other secrets of mass production lay hidden in the medieval arsenal? The whispers in the stone walls were not the only secret communications the castle received. High above, another silent conversation was taking place, written in the light of the moon, beyond the well-documented alignments with the sun. A more subtle and controversial layer of astro-architecture exists in the bones of certain fortresses. Some master masons appear to have designed their structures to harness the lunar cycle itself, turning the castle into a celestial calendar. A specific window in the chapel, or a uniquely shaped arrow slit in the Lord's private chamber, might seem like a random architectural choice. But on the night of a full moon, or perhaps a significant new moon, a beam of silver light would pierce that opening with perfect precision. It would travel across the floor, illuminating a particular carving on the far wall, a specific stone in the foundation, or even the altar itself. This was not for practical illumination. It was for ceremony and power. In a world governed by faith and superstition, the ability to predict and manifest such an event was a profound demonstration of the Lord's connection to the cosmos. It suggested his rule was in harmony with the very heavens. The master mason, acting as both engineer and astronomer, had to calculate the exact angle for that window, not just for one night, but for the slow 18-year cycle of the moon's journey across the sky. He was encoding a celestial event into the static stone, creating a ritual that could be repeated for generations. This lunar alignment was a hidden layer of meaning, a secret spectacle of light reserved for the most privileged eyes within the fortress. It transformed a cold stone room into a theater of cosmic endorsement, where the walls did not just defend the body, but also sanctified the soul's place in the universe. If the castle could commune with the moon, what other earthly powers did it draw upon from the landscape itself? The true horror waiting in the murder holes was far more inventive than simple boiling oil. While cauldrons of oil were certainly used, they were a precious, expensive resource. The castle's real arsenal of terror was made from cheap, readily available, and chemically vicious materials. The most common substance poured down was not oil at all, but boiling water. Yet even this was often enhanced into something truly monstrous. Defenders would mix in vast quantities of sand or gravel. This created a scalding, abrasive slurry that behaved in a uniquely gruesome way. When it poured onto a knight in plate armor, the liquid component would not just splash off. It would seep through the gaps and joints in the steel plates, the neck, the armpits, the knees. The boiling water would scald the skin beneath, while the sand and grit would follow, embedding itself in the wounds and under the skin, causing excruciating infection and making the burns impossible to clean. It was a cheap, effective way to incapacitate even the most heavily armored foe, but the ultimate chemical weapon was quicklime. This was a simple white powder made from burned limestone, but its effect on the human body was pure alchemical nightmare. Stored in dry barrels high in the gatehouse, it would be hurled down in sacks or simply shoveled through the murder holes on the attackers below. On its own, the powder was a severe irritant. The real horror began when it met moisture. The perspiration on a soldier's skin, the rain, or even the humidity in his own breath would trigger an immediate and violent chemical reaction. Quicklime is highly caustic, and upon contact with water, it heats up rapidly, reaching temperatures capable of causing severe thermal burns. It would essentially cook the flesh it touched while simultaneously releasing corrosive vapors that could blind a man if they reached his eyes. Attackers trapped in the stone throat of the gatehouse would find themselves caught in an invisible, searing cloud, their own sweat turning against them in a fiendish reaction they could not possibly comprehend. And then there was the ghost of ancient warfare, a weapon so feared its recipe was a state-secret Greek fire. This was the medieval equivalent of napalm, a sticky, flammable liquid that could not be extinguished with water. In fact, water would often make it spread and burn more fiercely. It was typically pumped through siphons, but there is compelling evidence that smaller pots of it were also dropped through murder holes onto siege engines or groups of soldiers massed at the base of the walls. The sight of men burning, unable to douse the flames, screaming as they were consumed by a fire that clung to them and crawled across the ground, would have been a psychological blow from which few armies could recover. This was not merely about killing invaders. It was about breaking their spirit with a spectacle of suffering, using chemistry and cruelty to turn the castle's shadow into a place of unimaginable agony. Every winding stone staircase you climb in a medieval castle is a lie. It pretends to be a simple path between floors, but it is actually one of the most brilliant and universal defensive traps ever conceived. The secret is not in the steps themselves, but in their relentless, predictable direction. Across Europe, with astonishing consistency, the spiral staircases in castle towers ascend in a clockwise direction. This was not an architectural coincidence or a builder's whim. It was a deadly calculation designed to give the defender an insurmountable advantage in the confined, brutal chaos of close-quarters combat. The entire design revolved around a simple fact of human biology. The vast majority of people, then as now, are right-handed. Now, picture a right-handed attacker, a knight or a soldier, storming his way up that clockwise spiral. As he rounds the tight curve, his sword arm, his dominant arm, is pinned against the central stone column of the staircase. He cannot swing his weapon in a wide, powerful arc. Every movement is cramped, restricted, and choked by the wall on his right side. He is forced to fight at a grotesque disadvantage, his greatest weapon rendered almost useless in the narrow space. Meanwhile, the defender holds the high ground from above. He is not climbing. He is descending, moving down the stairs with the central column on his left side. For a right-handed defender, this is the perfect fighting position. His sword arm is on the outside of the curve, completely free and unhindered. He has the full, sweeping range of motion to slash, thrust, and parry. He can wield a larger weapon, like a poleaxe, with devastating effect. The staircase itself becomes his ally, funneling his enemies into a predictable, cramped line where he can pick them off one by one. This was a built-in, automated advantage for the home team, a geometric rule that favored the castle's guardians in every single encounter on the stairs. It turned every ascent into a deadly, uphill battle against the very architecture. The next time you grip a smooth, worn central stone column in a spiral stair, you are touching the cold, hard logic of medieval survival, a secret so effective it was carved into the bones of nearly every fortress. That same deceptive ingenuity found in stone was perfected in wood. Hidden beneath the slate and tile roofs, within the vast cavern of the Great Hall, lay a skeleton of timber engineered with a complexity that modern carpenters struggle to replicate. This was the lost art of the master framer, a man who worked not with mortar but with geometry and the grain of ancient oaks. His structures were not nailed together. They were woven, using a secret language of joints that locked the wood into a single, breathing entity. The most critical of these was the scarf joint, a masterful connection used to join two massive timbers end to end, creating a beam longer than any single tree. This was not a simple butt joint. It was an interlocking puzzle of angled faces, hidden wedges, and tapered shoulders, all cut with such precision that the two pieces slid together and then locked, becoming stronger than the original uncut wood. When a siege engine's projectile struck the roof or an earthquake shook the foundations, a nailed building would shudder and splinter, but a framed hall would sway. It would flex and groan, its joints absorbing the shock and distributing the force throughout the entire structure. The frame was not rigid. It was alive, a supple wooden cage that could dance with the forces trying to destroy it, and then settle back into place unharmed. This art required a mind that could see the finished, three-dimensional puzzle in a stack of raw timber, and the skill to carve it with nothing more than an axe, an adze, and a set of handmade chisels. The great hall's roof was not merely a shelter. It was a suspended forest, engineered to outlast the stone walls it crowned. How many other forgotten arts were woven into the very fabric of these ancient fortresses? The castle did not merely observe the passage of time. It actively measured it with the precision of a celestial instrument. The entire fortress was engineered to function as a colossal sundial, its towers and walls casting shadows that told the hour, the season, and even the date. For a community that lived by the rhythms of prayer and harvest, this hidden timekeeping system was as vital as any weapon in the armory. The master mason would design the layout so that the shadow of the great keep would fall upon specific markers at precise moments. A certain notch carved into the inner bailey wall might be touched by the shadow's edge only at noon, signaling the main meal for the entire household. Another, more subtle carving on the chapel's outer wall might only be illuminated by the last sliver of sunset light on the winter solstice, marking the year's shortest day and the slow turn back toward spring. This was not just about telling time. It was about synchronizing the life of the castle with the cosmos itself. The shadow of a tower creeping across the courtyard was a clock everyone could read, dictating the times for the canonical prayers, the changing of the guard, and the start and end of the laborer's day in the fields beyond the walls. The fortress was a giant stone calendar, its silent, moving hands of shadow ensuring that the complex machine of medieval life operated in perfect, harmonious time. How many other daily rituals were quietly governed by the slow, patient dance of light and stone, high above the courtyard, staring down from rain spouts and looming from corbels. A silent parliament of stone creatures holds court. We call them gargoyles and grotesques, dismissing them as superstitious ornament. But these carvings were a sophisticated code, a public broadcast system for a world where few could read. Every beast, every symbol, and every coat of arms chiseled into the facade was a deliberate piece of propaganda, a warning or a sermon. The fearsome lion was not merely a decoration. It was a direct statement of the Lord's courage and kingly authority, a visual promise that he would defend his lands with a beast's ferocity. A graceful stag or hart symbolized wisdom and purity, suggesting the noble family was guided by godly virtue. But the language could also be a stark deterrent. A carving of a wolf might represent the penalty for treason, a grim reminder that outlaws would be hunted down like animals. For the vast, illiterate population, These images transformed the castle walls into an open-air storybook. A sequence of carvings could depict the tale of St. George slaying the dragon, a clear metaphor for the Lord's Christian duty to protect his people from evil. A grotesque figure of a demon being crushed under the weight of a stone arch was not just a random monster. It was a permanent, reassuring image that the forces of chaos were being literally held down by the power and order the castle represented. Even the placement was a message. A coat of arms carved over the main gate was a declaration of ownership, a territorial marker understood by everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest visiting ambassador. The castle did not just display the Lord's power through its size. It whispered his values, his lineage, and his threats in a language of stone that required no translation. If every carving was a word, then the entire fortress was a complex sentence, a permanent declaration of identity and intent. A castle's shadow was more than a place of fear, it was a marketplace. These fortresses were not isolated military outposts. They were the beating hearts of a deliberately planned economic revolution. The most brilliant secret of a lord's power was not just his ability to defend land, but his genius for creating wealth from the very ground he protected. He achieved this by founding an entire town directly at his castle gate. This was not a random settlement that grew over time. It was a strategic masterstroke, a pre-planned commercial engine designed to fund the castle's own staggering costs. The Lord would issue a charter, a formal document that granted special privileges to anyone willing to live and work in the new town beneath his walls. He offered freedom from the oppressive duties of serfdom, the promise of his military protection, and most importantly, the right to practice a trade and sell goods freely. This charter was a magnet pulling skilled craftsmen from across the region. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and bakers would flock to the site, eager for a chance to control their own destiny. In return, the Lord imposed a system of taxes and tolls on every aspect of commercial life. Every cart that crossed the bridge he controlled paid a fee. Every merchant who sold his wares in the town square paid a stall tax. Every barrel of ale brewed in the town paid a duty. The castle was not just a consumer of vast resources, it became a factory for generating them. This economic zone was so potent that some lords secured the ultimate prize, the right to mint their own coins. This meant that the very currency of the region, stamped with the lord's own emblem, would originate from within his walls, a constant circulating advertisement of his sovereign power. The wealth generated from this bustling town at his doorstep paid for the stone, the mortar, and the armies that kept the entire system secure. The fortress and the market were two halves of a single organism, a self-sustaining cycle where commerce built the walls, and the walls, in turn, protected the commerce. The true measure of a castle's strength was not just the height of its keep, but the bustling, prosperous town thriving safely in its shadow. Every fortress has a hidden key, a secret flaw designed by its own creator. The ultimate secret of medieval castle construction is not about perfect defense, but about a single, deliberate weakness. Master masons, in their absolute loyalty to a lord, would sometimes engineer a fatal vulnerability known only to the ruler and his most trusted heir. This was not a mistake or a structural failure. It was a final, desperate contingency plan. Imagine a single stone in the mighty keep, indistinguishable from its neighbors to any outside observer. But for the Lord, its location was a deeply guarded secret. If a siege was lost, and enemy soldiers were pouring through the breached walls, all hope seemed gone. Yet in this moment of defeat, the castle's own architect had provided one last weapon. A trusted retainer could strike that specific stone with a heavy hammer, or pull a hidden lever connected to a critical archway. The result would not be a small collapse. The design was calculated to trigger a cascading failure, perhaps bringing down a key section of the inner wall, blocking the main gate from the inside, or even causing the great hall's roof to buckle. The goal was not to save the castle, but to deny it to the enemy. A ruined, blocked fortress was of little strategic value to a conquering army. It was the architectural equivalent of a king sacrificing his own queen to win the game. This secret vulnerability transformed the castle from a mere stronghold into a loyal servant that could be commanded to destroy itself rather than be turned against its rightful master. The same genius that built an icon of power also secretly designed its self-destruct mechanism. What other final, devastating commands were whispered from lord to mason, and then carved in silent stone? These silent stone giants were never just piles of rock. They were living, breathing systems of astonishing ingenuity, from walls that listened and whispered, to gatehouses that were masterpieces of psychological terror. We have walked through their secret quarries and deciphered the coded marks of their builders. We have seen how they harnessed the seasons and mixed self-healing mortar, creating structures that were less like buildings and more like organisms designed for survival. Every stone was a deliberate choice, every angle a calculated defense, and every shadow a measured part of a cosmic clock. These castles represent the absolute pinnacle of medieval technology and psychological design, a perfect fusion of brute force and brilliant subtlety. The next time you see a castle, look closer. What secrets is it still keeping? Let us know in the comments which construction secret amazed you the most. And don't forget to subscribe as we continue to unravel history's greatest mysteries.